He bought a rotting barn for 30 cents at a county tax auction. In any rational world, that price should have sparked a bidding war. Land was valuable in Harlow County, and even a dilapidated structure on 2 acres should have fetched at least a few dollars. But when the auctioneer called for bids, the crowd of weathered farmers stood silent, their eyes fixed on anything except the property listing. Elias Crain raised his hand almost as a joke, offering 3 dimes just to break the uncomfortable stillness. The auctioneer's gavel came down so fast it startled him. No one congratulated him. No one offered to shake his hand. Instead, an elderly woman approached with tears in her eyes and whispered words that would haunt him for weeks to come. "You just bought yourself a grave, young man. That barn sits on ground that's been cursed since 1847, and whatever's buried underneath, it has already claimed better men than you." Chapter 1. The Barn Nobody Wanted. Elias Crain had arrived in Harlow County 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a worn leather satchel and the bitter taste of failure still fresh on his tongue. A banking collapse back east had swallowed his modest savings, his employment, and any prospects of rebuilding his former life. The Western Territories promised fresh starts for men willing to work, and Elias was desperate enough to believe those promises. The county tax auction had seemed like providence. Properties seized for unpaid taxes sold for fractions of their true value, and Elias had scraped together $12 hoping to secure enough land for a small homestead. He had watched lot after lot sell to eager buyers, farmers and speculators competing fiercely for every acre. Then the auctioneer announced the Whitmore property, and everything changed. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and unsettling. Conversations died mid-sentence. Farmers who had been elbowing each other for position suddenly found reasons to step backward, creating an empty semicircle around the auction block. The auctioneer himself seemed reluctant to proceed, shuffling his papers and clearing his throat repeatedly before reading the description. 2 acres with barn structure, formerly belonging to Josiah Whitmore, seized for 7 years of unpaid taxes. The auctioneer's voice carried none of the enthusiasm he had shown for previous lots. "Starting bid is $1. Silence answered him. Elias glanced around, confused by the sudden change in energy. These same men had been shouting over each other moments ago. Yet now they stood mute and uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone around them. 50 cents, the auctioneer tried again, a note of pleading entering his tone. Surely someone wants 2 acres for 50 cents. Nothing. The silence stretched until it became almost physically painful. Elias felt the weight of it pressing against his chest, that peculiar heaviness that accompanies moments of collective dread. He raised his hand before his brain could stop him, offering 30 cents simply to end the awkwardness. The auctioneer practically threw the gavel down, declaring the sale complete with obvious relief. But as Elias stepped forward to claim his deed, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Several farmers were making the sign of the cross. Others were shaking their heads with expressions of genuine pity. The elderly woman who approached him introduced herself as Miriam Hollister, and her warning about cursed ground might have seemed like rural superstition if not for the absolute conviction in her voice. She told him about the Whitmore family, how Josiah's grandfather had built that barn in 1845 and discovered something terrible while digging beneath it 2 years later. 3 men went down into whatever he found. Only one came back up, and he was never the same afterward. Elias thanked her politely and dismissed her concerns as folklore, the kind of ghost stories that accumulated around old properties like dust on forgotten furniture. But he noticed that even the auction workers refused to accompany him to the property. They handed him the deed and a rough map, then found urgent business elsewhere. He walked the 3 miles to his new acquisition alone, arriving as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. The barn stood at the edge of a meadow, surrounded by overgrown grass that reached past his waist. From a distance, it looked exactly like what 30 cents should buy, a sagging structure with gaps in its wooden siding and a roof that had surrendered to decades of neglect. But as Elias drew closer, something struck him as wrong. The decay was superficial. Beneath the weathered exterior, The support beams remained solid. The foundation showed no signs of settling or structural failure. Someone had maintained this building while simultaneously making it appear abandoned, a deliberate disguise that raised more questions than answers. Inside, the barn smelled of rotting hay and animal musk, though no livestock had occupied it for years. Elias moved through the dim interior, his boots crunching on dried organic matter, until his foot struck something solid beneath the debris. He knelt and began clearing away the accumulated detritus, revealing wooden planks that didn't match the rest of the flooring. A hatch, heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, set into the ground like a seal over something that demanded containment. Strange symbols had been carved into its surface, patterns that looked almost like letters from an alphabet Elias didn't recognize. He ran his fingers over the grooves and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Whatever lay beneath this hatch, the farmers of Harlow County had feared it for nearly 50 years. And now, for the price of 30 cents, it belonged to him. Chapter 2. What the Farmers Knew. The Harlow County Record's office occupied a cramped room in the back of the general store, staffed by a nervous clerk named Edwin, who seemed perpetually startled by human interaction. When Elias inquired about the history of the Whitmore property, Edwin's already pale complexion went completely white. "Most folks don't ask about that place," Edwin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's good reason the taxes went unpaid for 7 years. Josiah Whitmore would rather lose the land than set foot near it, and his father felt the same way before him." Elias pressed for details, and reluctantly, Edwin retrieved a leather-bound ledger containing property transfer records dating back to the county's founding. The entries for the Whitmore barn told a troubling story. Between 1848 and 1890, the property had changed hands 7 times. Each new owner had abandoned it within months, most leaving the county entirely. Several had sold for catastrophic losses, accepting pennies on the dollar just to rid themselves of the deed. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Something about that property drove people away, and the fear had persisted across generations. Edwin shared the local legend in hushed tones, glancing toward the door as if worried about eavesdroppers. In 1847, Ezekiel Whitmore, Josiah's grandfather, decided to expand his barn by adding a root cellar. His workers began digging and struck something unexpected, a void in the earth, an existing chamber that predated their excavation. Ezekiel and 2 hired hands descended to investigate, carrying lanterns and the confidence of men who had never encountered anything they couldn't explain. The hired hands were never seen again. Ezekiel emerged 3 days later, alone, his hair having turned completely white despite being only 40 years old. He refused to speak about what happened underground. He sealed the hatch with iron and oak, carved those strange symbols into the wood, and forbade anyone from ever opening it again. He lived another 20 years, but never spent a single night in that barn. Elias asked if anyone had ever defied the prohibition, and Edwin's expression suggested the answer was complicated. There had been attempts over the decades, curious individuals who dismissed the warnings as superstition. Most lost their nerve before actually opening the hatch. The few who persisted either abandoned their efforts suddenly or vanished entirely, adding new layers to the legend. Armed with this information, Elias sought out Miriam Hollister again. He found her in a small cottage at the edge of town, surrounded by dried herbs and old photographs. She received him without surprise, as if she had been expecting his return. "My grandfather was one of those hired hands," she confirmed, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Jacob Hollister. He went down into that hole in 1847 and never came back. My grandmother waited for him until the day she died, convinced he was still alive somewhere in the darkness." Miriam possessed her grandmother's diary, a fragile document she handled with reverent care. She turned to a specific entry dated November 1847, written in handwriting that shook with emotion. The words were sparse but devastating. They found the old ones keeping place. "God help us all. Jacob is gone. Ezekiel says he cannot be saved. He says nothing can be saved now that the seal is broken. The old ones, Elias asked what that phrase meant, but Miriam could only shake her head. Her grandmother never explained, and Ezekiel Whitmore had taken his secrets to the grave. That night, Elias returned to the barn with a lantern and basic tools, determined to examine the hatch more closely before deciding his next move. But as he approached the structure, he noticed light flickering through the gaps in the siding. Someone was already inside. He entered cautiously, his heart pounding against his ribs. The barn appeared empty, but evidence of recent activity was unmistakable. Fresh scratches marked the hatch where someone had attempted to pry it open. A lantern sat nearby, its glass still warm to the touch. Whoever had been here had left moments before his arrival, possibly alerted by his approach. Elias was not the only person interested in what lay beneath the Whitmore barn, and unlike him, the other seeker clearly preferred to work in secret. Chapter 3. The Descent. The hatch resisted his efforts for nearly an hour before finally surrendering. The iron bands had corroded over decades, but the oak remained formidable, requiring careful application of his crowbar to separate the seal without destroying the underlying mechanism. When the cover finally lifted, a smell rose from below that Elias couldn't identify. Not decay exactly, but something ancient, the accumulated breath of air that hadn't circulated since before he was born. His lantern revealed stone steps descending into darkness, carved with a precision that seemed impossible for hand tools. Elias hesitated at the threshold, remembering Miriam's warnings and the 50 years of fear that surrounded this place. But curiosity had always been his weakness, and the mystery had already claimed too much of his attention to abandon now. The descent took longer than expected. The steps continued far deeper than any root cellar would require, passing through layers of earth and stone until Elias estimated he was at least 40 feet below the surface. The walls transitioned from packed soil to natural limestone, carved into a tunnel that extended beyond his lantern's reach. This was no farmer's excavation. The tunnel belonged to a network of chambers that predated European settlement by centuries, perhaps millennia. Elias found evidence of the original inhabitants almost immediately. Pottery fragments bearing geometric patterns, stone tools scattered like offerings, and ceremonial objects whose purpose he couldn't begin to guess. Whatever civilization had created these passages had vanished long before Harlow County existed, leaving behind only these silent testimonials to their presence. But the native artifacts weren't what made Elias's blood run cold. Deeper in the tunnel system, past several branching corridors he chose not to explore, he discovered a chamber that clearly showed modern influence. Wooden shelves lined the walls, bearing ledgers, photographs, and documents spanning decades. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered with maps and correspondence. The Whitmore family hadn't been protecting a curse. They had been protecting evidence. Elias began examining the materials with growing horror. The ledgers contained meticulous records of land transactions dating back to the county's founding, documenting systematic theft from native peoples through fraudulent surveys and forged agreements. Photographs showed meetings between county officials and territorial representatives, accompanied by captions identifying specific bribes and intimidation campaigns. Letters revealed a conspiracy involving the founding families of Harlow County, men whose descendants still controlled local politics and commerce. The curse had been invented to keep people away from proof of crimes that could destroy the county's entire power structure. Generations of Whitmores had maintained the deception, adding new evidence as new crimes accumulated, creating an archive of corruption that grew more dangerous with each passing decade. But someone else had discovered this chamber recently. Elias found a journal near the desk, its pages filled with handwriting that didn't match the older documents. The author identified himself as Thomas Whitmore, Josiah's son, and his entries described a 6-month investigation into his family secrets. Thomas had begun questioning the legend after discovering inconsistencies in his father's stories. His investigation led him to the hatch, then to the chamber, and finally to a decision that would cost him everything. He planned to expose the conspiracy, to deliver the evidence to authorities who could hold the founding families accountable. The final entry was dated 6 months before Elias arrived in Harlow County. Thomas wrote that he suspected someone was watching him, that his questions had attracted dangerous attention. He intended to make copies of the most damaging documents and hide them somewhere safe before confronting the conspirators directly. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if Thomas had been interrupted while writing. Elias understood now why no one had bid on the property. The founding families couldn't risk an outsider discovering what lay beneath the barn. They had let the taxes lapse deliberately, hoping to eventually reclaim the land through channels they controlled. His unexpected purchase had disrupted their plans. A sound from above made him freeze. Footsteps on the barn floor, multiple sets moving with purpose. Voices called out, demanding he show himself. Elias extinguished his lantern and pressed against the chamber wall, his mind racing through options that grew more limited by the second. He had found what no farmer dared to touch. Now he had to survive long enough to make it matter. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The men who descended into the chamber carried lanterns and weapons with equal confidence. Elias recognized their leader from the auction, Harrison Cole, whose family name appeared throughout the conspiracy documents. 2 others flanked him, younger men with the cold expressions of those accustomed to following orders without question. "We've been watching you since the auction," Cole admitted, his tone conversational despite the threat his presence implied. "Hope you might lead us to whatever Thomas Whitmore found before his unfortunate accident. Seems our patience has been rewarded." Elias stood his ground, though his heart hammered against his chest. "Thomas didn't have an accident, did he? You killed him for what he discovered." Cole's smile carried no warmth. Thomas made the mistake of threatening exposure without understanding the scope of what he was threatening to expose. 50 years of business arrangements, partnerships that keep this county functioning. His naive crusade for justice would have destroyed families who had nothing to do with decisions made by their grandfathers. The justification rang hollow, but Elias understood the psychology behind it. Cole and his companions had convinced themselves they were protectors rather than criminals, guardians of stability rather than murderers covering their ancestors' sins. What Cole didn't know was that Elias had prepared for this possibility. Before descending into the chamber, he had spent hours examining the most damaging documents. The previous night, he had ridden to the territorial capital and mailed copies to both the governor's office and the editor of the largest newspaper in the region. He had also visited Miriam Hollister and shared everything he'd learned, asking her to contact federal authorities if he didn't return by morning. "You're too late," Elias said, allowing himself a grim smile. "The evidence is already beyond your reach. Whatever you do to me, the truth is coming out." Cole's confidence wavered. "You're bluffing. You've only been in this chamber for a few hours. Long enough to read what matters. Long enough to make copies. And long enough to ensure those copies are in the hands of people you can't intimidate or bribe." The standoff stretched until footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance. Cole spun toward the sound, his weapon raised, but lowered it slowly as uniforms emerged from the darkness. Federal marshals, their badges glinting in the lantern light, followed by Miriam Hollister and several farmers who had overcome decades of fear to accompany them. Miriam had done exactly as Elias hoped. When he failed to return by midnight, she had ridden through the night to summon the territorial marshal. The federal authorities, already alerted by Elias's mail documents, had dispatched officers immediately. The arrest of Harrison Cole and his companions took only minutes. Without their network of corrupt local officials to protect them, the founding family's power collapsed like a structure built on sand. The marshals secured the evidence chamber and began the meticulous process of cataloging decades of documented crimes. Thomas Whitmore's body was recovered 2 days later from a collapsed section of tunnel, answering the question of his fate while confirming the depths of the conspiracy's violence. His journal and preparations had laid the groundwork that Elias ultimately used to achieve the justice Thomas died pursuing. The weeks that followed transformed Harlow County beyond recognition. Federal investigators worked through the evidence systematically, issuing indictments that reached the highest levels of territorial government. Land titles were reviewed and corrected, returning thousands of acres to native families whose ancestors had been defrauded. Several prominent citizens fled before they could be arrested. Others chose cooperation and confession in exchange for reduced sentences. The newspapers called it the greatest scandal in territorial history. Elias called it incomplete justice for generations of victims. He kept the barn, though he tore down the original structure and built something new in its place. The underground chambers became a public archive, accessible to anyone who wanted to understand the true history of Harlow County. Scholars came to study the native artifacts. Families came to research their stolen heritage. Truth seekers came to understand how conspiracy and silence could persist across generations. Miriam Hollister finally learned what happened to her grandfather in 1847. Jacob Hollister hadn't been killed by a curse. He had been murdered by Ezekiel Whitmore after discovering the first evidence of land fraud. The horror that turned Ezekiel's hair white wasn't supernatural. It was the realization of what he had become, a killer protecting crimes he had helped commit. On the first anniversary of his 30-cent purchase, Elias stood outside his rebuilt barn watching families enter the archive. The curse was broken, not by ritual or magic, but by the simple power of exposure. What no farmer dared to touch had been brought into the light, and the darkness that once protected evil now illuminated the path toward justice. Some truths demand a witness. Some secrets demand a reckoning. And sometimes, the courage to open a door that others fear is worth more than any price paid for the land beneath it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and truth collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into mystery.